All right, so here's our idea spreadsheet. Anyone, go ahead. Okay, slowly the ideas are starting to be filled in. Go ahead and claim these for people. And this way it's kind of a good springboard for people to form ideas off of and form groups. So we have the basic room set up. I ran Rails DB migrate, so now we have messages as well. And looking at the schema, we have our messages and we have our rooms. Let's take a look at messages. Messages belongs to a room. Great, we'll add the opposite. So we'll say a room, right, has many messages. And again, we'll say dependent destroy just for data consistency. Great. So on the page, right, where we have a room, we want to start showing, be able to create a message, send a message to the room, right? So in HTML, right, you can create a simple form action, right? And so you have a form, you have some sort of action, and you have a method equals post, right? And the action would be to create a message, which would look something like room, right? And this is just the first room and message, right? And that's how you want to create that in HTML. But Rails provides a nice handy helper for that. And this is the form for, right? And some we've all used before. But this time we want to create a nested resource, right? So if we look at our routes again, right, we have rooms and messages as nested resources. And we've set them up so that the message belongs to a room and that has that relationship. So how do we create that handily with the form for, right? So we'll do a form for, and we can say at room and then at message, right? We haven't defined the message yet, so we can define that in the controller. So if we wanted to, right, this is the rooms controller. The rooms, we could put it in the rooms controller. Under, I believe this is the show, so we could do something like this, right? Or we could just do it the simple way and just define it here. So we'll say message.new, right? And so now I want to create our form. And right, the form for now has a nested route. So it'll send up something that looks kind of like this. It'll send up room / with the ID of the room and then the message. So that's pretty handy because right, we can create this nested resource and it knows that the message now belongs to the room. So then let's go ahead and fill it out. And we're going to want body. Also going to want a username so that we can keep track of who is sending it to the group. And same thing, it's a text field, username. Great. And we'll see how that looks. What's the error? Number of arguments. Oh, yeah. Cool. Formatting is not great, but it's not a big deal. All right. And lastly, we need to do a submit button as well. And so nil. create message. Great. So right, it'll take us to the route in our messages controller. Right, it'll take us to create. Right, and so we said this URL. If we look at the route again, right, we check out our routes, and we want to create now a message, right, with the room messages path, and it will be create. So it'll be up here. So we have this nested resource, and we can get the room ID from the route, and the form knows how to route it, supply that room ID for us. So great, we have our create function. We can do something like this. Before we've done this, and this would be params. What goes in here? Right, ID. No, right, it could be room ID. Right, and if we look at our route again, we can see that the room ID is a part of the route. So we're creating a message. We don't have yet a message ID, but we're creating it on the room. And that's handy. Or we can define it as a private method. So we'll just define that here. And that way we can just say set room. And we have that for us. Great. So we've set ourselves a room. Now we need to go ahead and create the message. Right? And we could say message.new. And then we could supply it, a room ID. Right? And the room could be at room. Or we can just do it the Rails way, which is build it on the room itself. And it automatically adds in that link, and that actually should be messages. So it'll automatically connect the two, and it'll set the room ID field on the message when you do it this way. And we want what the message params. Great, so now we need to find message params. And params.require message permit username and body. Lastly, we're just going to create some quick validation. Oops, thank you. And we've defined our model relationships to be great. So validate. Oh. So we send a message test and from me. Great. So far we haven't yet displayed the messages. We've only displayed hard-coded in thing. So we'll start to go ahead and display the messages here. So this is back in the room, the show view, right? And so far we have just message one. What we want to display is what? Like a concept of a message dot body, right? So that means we need something like right, we'll create a block, and we'll go ahead and display for each message the message body. We also probably want to display the username. So username, and I'm thinking here, make this, let's say, badge, primary, be a little different formatting. Great. And here we forgot messages.each. I believe messages is undefined. Yeah, so it's asking us, right, if we check out at messages, it's nil, so it's throwing an error. So we'll go ahead and define that in the room controller, right? We have our show action, and we'll add messages to it. And what goes here, right? At room.messages. Nice. Test Bob. And then we need, yep, no template found, so thank you, redirect. So that was create. Oh, we didn't actually even build it. We just we built it, but we didn't actually save it. Redirect to, and we'll just say redirect to the room. Else flash error, and we'll just show it the easy way. So we'll say message full messages to sentence. And we'll redirect to again the room. Cool. So see what happens. And there we go. And we have some kind of funky formatting here with the username going across the top. Maybe we can abstract out this thing here. Okay, at least now we have a username and a message. Does that all make sense for everyone so far? Right, so we defined in our room show here, we defined a form for using a nested resource, and this helps us to determine what route to hit, right? And then in the context of the controller, when we get here, we can find the room because the room is determined by the room ID, right? Is that clear for everyone? Okay. So now let's see what the user experience is like. So we come to the home page, and we say this is a basic chat app, and with this we want to create a room. So we'll say like Java room. It'll take us to Java room, and we'll say hi everyone. And we'll just create some, right? And now there's some messages that are starting to come in. Right? So we have a basic kind of concept like that. But let's say we want to make it so that the user can create both a room and a message at the same time, right? They come here to this homepage, and they want to go ahead and kind of instantly get into a message and a room and not kind of delay about. So let's see if we can kind of create both of those with one action and see what that kind of looks like. So let's look at our home controller. This is the controller that determines that home view when we first arrive on the home page. And right now, all it kind of shows is the index. It shows each room. Let's go ahead and we want them to be able to create a new room and a new message on the fly, right? So we'll go ahead and room.messages.build. So we'll create here for them a new room and a new message so they can start to fill out some more information. So then we'll take us to the home index, and here they have the option to create a new room. So we'll add in some more fields. And maybe we'll say, username and first message. And what do we want to do here? I'll put this in the context of the form for. So we said we want them to be able to create a room, and we already have that via this form for. But we also want them to be able to create a message. So we couldn't just say form for, right? Because we already have one form for that governs this form. And remember, form for is like a helper. It's a form with a post and an action. But we have this nested resource set up. And so rather than saying form for, we can go ahead and say fields for. And some people, I think, use this in their homework. How many people use this in their homework? Okay, just a few. So let's check out the API docs. And we'll show fields for. And there's a few ways to do it. So sometimes so with a form for, right, we typically pass in an object that we've defined either in the controller or we define it in the context of the view. With fields for, you have some options. You can pass in a symbol, and then you can pass in an actual object. And it knows that it'll put the fields beneath it as part of that object. You can often simplify this. So in this case, they only pass in the symbol, and it knows based off the symbol to by the name of the model. Oops. If it also is instance variable with the same name, then it knows how to connect the two. You also can do the opposite. So if you pass in just an object, it knows how to look up the class name and determine what field should be set from there. So it's pretty powerful to kind of have that nested resource. And let's go ahead and start to use that here. So we're going to say fields for, and here we go. So right, we want it to be for a message, so we're going to define it as a symbol. And you could do something like FF to differentiate. It starts to get a little confusing though, so I'm just going to go ahead and call this field. And so now what do we want to do? Well, we want some fields that pertain to messages. So similarly, we want a text field, and we'll say username. We could also do the standard field.label. Right, that works as well. Or we can just keep it simple and use an example like a placeholder username. And you even can pass in, you can make it fancier and add in required. So you can say required false or required true. And we're going to do something similar with the body. And we'll say, maybe your first message, or enter your first message. And we won't make it required. Right, so now we've defined using fields for this message. But what happens if we send it up as is, right? Will it actually go ahead and, we forgot a submit button, always important. That's here. Cool, and now we have some funky formatting. So we'll just move this guy out there. Cool. And we'll just make this a little more instructive, so that's fine. So we have the name of the room and then username and first message and create room, right? What happens if we fill this out now? Right, we'll create the room, but we actually didn't listen to any of the parameters coming in. Let's inspect the logs. So this is the log. We have our post to rooms, and we have rooms, right? Can everyone see this? Room as one of the keys in the parameters. And we have the name of the room. Great. So we created the room with the right name. We also know how this message attribute. And the message attribute has some of the fields that we typed in that pertain to the message attribute, right? So this is the nested resource we were talking about. Now we have to handle it. Nothing so far has been listening to this, so nothing is expecting it to come back. So let's go ahead and add that in. So when we create a room, it takes us to the room controller. Right here, right, we're looking at certain parameters. And what we want, if we could do this very manually. So after we create the room, we could say, let's look at the room, and let's look at the messages, right? And we could do this very manually, and we say, all right, given the messages, there's some certain fields I expect to be here. I can save those and create a message. But with all things, there's a Rails way to do it, and we actually can go ahead and add that down here. So we can say we require the room, and we permit the name, and we also permit the messages. And in order to save that in one action, we'll go ahead and define on the rooms. And the command is accepts nested attribute for. Messages. Right? So let's inspect. If we add this line in, accepts nested attributes from messages, let's see what happens. Let's go ahead and inspect. Go back to our view. here, right, we see the name of this field is room, message, and username. Right, so it's starting to, it'll pass it in under the hash that we saw under the parameters, which is good. Accepts nested attributes for messages, and then the controller, we actually want to go ahead and let's see, so we have messages. Great, so we added in here messages, and then we added it into the model in the room. Accepts nested attributes for messages. Great, and our home controller, we have these room and messages defined here. Let's go ahead and see what happens when we try to create one. So go to Android. Say Bob. Say test message. Right, it didn't save. And if we look at here, we see it as message attributes. And so in the room controller, right, we said messages, but it won't actually pass up an array. It'll expect it to be a field. And so we have to define the values in the specific parameter that we expect to see. So here we have message, and it has certain values in the hash, so we have to specify those as well. So we'll say username and body. Go back. We'll enter our first message. And now we have unknown attribute message for room. So let's see, where are we? Room is around line 9. And we get room params. Attributes. So it looks like we have access to the fields in the message. Room params is looking good.
You have to say message attributes.
Yeah, but here it's showing up as messages, right? So if we did room params, message attributes, right? Those are nil. That's under message. Like that. Let's see. For message attributes. Yeah. Let's see. Let's see. So now we got it to work, but I think it, because we said message attributes, yeah, unpermitted parameter message, it dropped it. That's because I want to make sure I'm defining this right. Accepts nested attributes for. Make sure we have this syntax right. Yeah, so we have a has-many relationship, and we have accepts as attributes for pages. So that's defined correctly. Messages. These forms are always here. It's a group programming session now. There should be message attributes. Especially when they form them. Let's see. See if we define it for @message. There we go. All right, now we're going to see where this is. Home controller. Oh, now we have no fields. For the message. Can't seem to get this one to work. Message. Why is it not message attributes?
Maybe in the controller you can define a new room and then use the form for to create it.
Yeah. Say @message. Huh, just looking at a message. And not message attributes. So I agree, I think it should be message attributes. Like this. That's how we defined it, message attributes for. There's some part of the Rails magic that I'm missing.
Then that form for should be
Here?
Yeah. Because it didn't let define the controller.
I think we have, yeah.
You want to build it on that.
Still message. Huh. Room @message. Field. No, we want to do that. Room message body. Yeah. And then that. Did I save? Did I find this right?
This is what I did right here. So
Yeah.
room.tickets.
Is that right? Accepts nested attributes for.
Accepts nested attributes for.
Yeah. Oh. Here,
At message.
getting messages. There it is. Alrighty. Thanks, guys. So now we have messages attributes. So in the controller, we'll define message attributes.
See when and where use symbol.
Yeah, Rails magic. And the messages. Yeah, another one. Thank you. So messages attributes and message attributes. Fantastic. So now we'll try a new chat room. And we'll create the room. There we go. So now we have created a new room with a new message. And great job, everyone. Collectively, we've mastered this. So to recap, right, we used field for and messages. I guess there's we're missing a plural, but the way to kind of tell is back on the home page, right, the room had messages attributes. So when you look at the parameters that come in, here we have a post request to create the room. It also has message attributes. And since we've whitelisted that as one of the parameters, it's gone ahead and created, given us access to that in the controller. So then in the controller, when we have the room, we can say room.new with the room parameters. And because the room accepts message attributes for messages, it also goes ahead and creates the room and the message for us. So that's good. So one last thing we want to do is maybe we'll add in a session. So unless current user is defined, actually, creating a room. So we'll say if room.messages.present messages.first.username. So we'll store a username, and then we'll go ahead and define that in our application controller. And we'll simply say it's the username, and we'll make it accessible, current user. So now maybe we come to the room, we want to send a new message. Right, we have our views, and you want to create a new username. Maybe we'll say here placeholder is current user. Great, so try it out. Didn't get the. Oh, that's on the. Oops, that's on the wrong view. That is. We want to do it on the room show. There we go. Cool, so we can kind of fill in the username for them as a placeholder. So it's very basic session-based authentication. So now that we actually have the actual basic app up and running, let's see if we can do a quick side-by-side between two different people. So we'll enter the C++ room. And here we'll say, oops, make it a incognito window. Cool. So the body is hello. Hey, Bob. Right, so we send a message, and right now it doesn't show up another user. If we refresh, it starts to show up. And I can start sending a message back, right? And so we have the basic premise of a chat, except right now the user has to refresh. So what can we do? Well, we could maybe help the user out and refresh on their behalf, right? So here we have in the show view for the room, this is what we're using to show all the different messages. We can start to add in some refresh logic. And we'll just do some embedded JavaScript here, right? So we can define a function that reloads. And what we'll do, well, I believe we can call window.location. And if we always want to test out our JavaScript, we can open up the console, which is a very great way to kind of play around with things. So we have window, let me see it, and we can then check out the location. And I believe you can even, redirect yourself to a new site if you wanted to. You could, take yourself somewhere else. You could say, and then you're going to Google. But if we do window.location, we can say reload, right? And then it reloads the page. Great. So window.location.reload. And as is, right, if we wanted to actually, so we send a message. Right, we send a message. And over here, well, we haven't refreshed yet. Refresh. Right, if we reload, it'll reload the page. So maybe we can do that for the users. So we can say set interval, and we'll call reload, and we'll call it every so often. So we'll say maybe every 3 seconds, go ahead and reload. So we've set it up. So now we have an auto reloader. But as you'll see, there's some problems, right? If you start to text or start to type, and it reloads on you in the middle, you lost all your data, right? So maybe just for the purpose of this demonstration, I'm going to make it 5 seconds. And if I can type quickly. Oh! Let's see if I can get it. Okay, right, then it shows up. But obviously there's many problems with that. The biggest being that if you, are middle of typing something, you lose that information. And so you can say, well, maybe we could just change that to, rather than 5 seconds, like 20 seconds. And that's a possibility. It's not great, but what it does then is, it slows down your information retrieval speed. So your information is that much out of date. It does give you a chance to actually type it in. So I could, show a funny demo. I'm trying to type it in. It keeps refreshing on me. Right. So at least now it's a little more. It's an improvement, we can say, than our previous. Right. The previous is if you didn't refresh, you wouldn't ever see anything. Right. You would just sit there all day and expect to see a message, and it wouldn't come up. And you have to remember to refresh, and then you see a message. So at least now we started adding a little bit of JavaScript for the user, so that if they are sitting there and they don't do anything, at least the page will refresh and it'll show them a new message. And so if they're in a chat room, they can not do anything, just sit back and just watch the messages come in. And that's great, right? But the problem with that, as you saw, is it refreshes the whole page. And we don't really need to refresh the whole page. Let's see if we can inspect one of the requests, right? So as it comes in, can we see one of the requests? So as it comes in, right, we get the entire HTML body again. And right, we get all this again. And a lot of these scripts are broken out in development, so they're in their own thing. In production, they're typically combined into one file. So you have like an application CSS, an application JS file. But it's still obviously a lot of information that is coming down with every request. and there it goes again. Right? We don't really need all this information because what's really changing? All that's really changing is the messages. The head staying the same. The JavaScript isn't really changing. The formatting is not really changing. And so we don't need to reload everything. Maybe we can be smarter and just reload the things that actually are changing. So let's see if we can go ahead and make that happen. So we have reload here. But when we send a new message, right, what if we add in remote true? I'm just going to comment that up. What does remote true do? Right, so let's, in true Rails fashion, check out the API docs. Let's see if we can find it. Remote. So by default, this behavior is to use an AJAX submit, right? So rather than submit and right away go ahead and refresh the page, AJAX, right, stands for asynchronous JavaScript and something. Does anybody know what the X stands for? XML. Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. So, and typically when we, in our app here, right, if we type in a message and we create message, right, the whole page reloads. And it kind of is a blocking call. It waits for the server to respond. So let's see if we can demo that. So I commented out this thing so it won't reload on us. But we're creating a new message in the context of the room. What if we sleep, right? What if we just add in a purposeful delay just to demonstrate what that would look like? So and this is Bob. Right, so we're going to sit here, and it's very poor UI. There's no really thing for the user to understand what's going on. Maybe the network is slow, right, or maybe the server dropped the request, but it's kind of just UI hangs, right? If you saw that, it just turned gray, and it didn't really let us push it, but nothing really was going on. It's not clear. So that's what happens right now when we have synchronous JavaScript, right? We press create message, and we won't know what to do until the server responds back with an answer. But what if we can use AJAX to actually create that process so that when it comes back, we're not waiting for that call to come back. So the first way we can do that is remote true. And if we go back to the documentation, it defaults to use an AJAX submission. So it will send it asynchronously and not synchronously. So that sounds promising. So we add remote true in, right, so, but now let's see how our actions are handled. So when we create this message, right, we're kind of creating building a message, shaving it, and redirecting it back to where we want to go. So let's see if we can set it up so we don't have to block for the messages. And I'm going to do respond to different sorts of format. Okay, so actually I'm going to take a quick step back, and in our action here, so we are calling reload, which is the whole page. What if we can just reload the stuff that's essential to what we want to see, which is our messages? So starting with Rails 5.1, they removed jQuery from Rails by default, but we've been adding it back in, especially in the context of Bootstrap, jQuery Rails. And there's actually a reason they did that. Remove jQuery from Rails. It's instructive to know why they did that. They removed it because they no longer needed it for parts of the compilation process. And here's actually the pull request or the issue from DHH, who's one of the original authors and still a maintainer of Rails. You see that they no longer need it for certain parts of Rails because it says JavaScript has done enough on its own. So it doesn't. They're not removing it because they don't like it. They just don't need it anymore. But we'll add it back in since it's still very useful for our use cases. And the way we can access jQuery is with the $sign. Right? Everyone's used jQuery before. Pretty familiar to most people. It provides a lot of functionality. A lot of it has since been added into JavaScript over the years. Earlier on, it was important because every browser has a different way of interpreting things, and jQuery is a nice standardizing library amongst all the browsers. Now it's not as useful because a lot of browsers have adopted similar syntax, especially for those who are curious and want to read more. ES6. So this was the latest update to JavaScript. It provides a lot of functionality that is really useful. Here's the documentation if you wanted to actually read into it. But there's some new features. I was reading this one this afternoon actually. Some new ES6 features that are really handy to know. You can, like, for example, with JavaScript now use default parameters. That's useful. You can have multi-line strings, which is just kind of nice. A few of the more promising ones that I liked are promises. So now with 6, you have arrow functions, so you can kind of make things easier to chain. You don't have to define _this as your context. Like the old way of doing it kind of looked like this, the _this, and now the new way is just adding in this arrow to keep the context. And you can also do some things with promises. So there's a lot that you can do in ES6, worth checking out for those who are curious. But we are going to use JavaScript. So we can send an AJAX request. And this way we won't actually refresh the whole page, but we'll send a request. When the data comes back in, maybe we can start to show what the data looks like and update the user. So we'll submit it to a URL, and this should be a string. So in this case, we want it to be the room messages path, and we gotta supply it the room so it knows which room to hit, right? And that'll hit for us the get index on the messages. So now let's go ahead and implement that. So we don't have that action defined yet, right? And same thing, we can say set room, and then we can say all the messages are just the room messages. That's pretty handy. And right, so we show here, but how do we actually start to implement? So the goal is to be able to asynchronously reload just the messages without having to refresh the whole page. Right? When you refresh the whole page, the user loses where they're typing. It's a poor experience. How do we refresh just the part that doesn't affect their experience but gets them the latest messages? So we're going to send a request to the room messages path, and we just define that action, and we'll return to them the messages. We have to display that, right? And so we have here is how we've been displaying messages. So maybe we can remove that to a partial, and we can kind of lean on that partial to display things. So, right, we can say render, and you can also say, render like messages like that. The Rails way will make it nice and simple. So now we need to go ahead and define that. So app views messages, and it's empty. So we have app views messages, and it's currently empty. So define a partial, so message. And we can copy this in. Oops. And let's just make sure that we had that working, that it's all hooked up correctly. Great, so our messages are still showing up. We have a lot of messages. It seems like we have some repeats. Say it again. Ah. Yep, thank you. Perfect. We were displaying it for each message, all the different messages that existed. Great. There we go. So maybe we can just refresh, right, this page. So when we hit here, our request, it's a room messages path. And rather than reload the page, right, we can say fetch latest messages, and then render layout is false. So it won't actually change anything on the layout. Now let's see what that looks like. So we have our request, and you actually can even do it .get, and then the first argument is just the string. Cool. So now we're going to provide a function, and this is our callback function, so that when something comes back from the server, we can say, great, got data back, and we'll print out the response. So let's see what that looks like. All right, and if we call reload, that we can print out the function, and we'll go ahead and call it, and we get a server error. Missing template messages index. Let's see, message controller, render layout false. It's not yet asking for JSON, so it shouldn't. What is it looking for? Formats HTML. So we got to define what we're looking for. So in the controller, we can say respond to do in format, and then this will listen to specific formats. So for example, we can say format.html or format.json. And in our request, we can then say, give it the URL, and we can say format is JS, like that. Great. And then the last thing is, so the controller is going to respond to two different types of format, and so it will respond with a JavaScript query or an HTML query with different responses. So we could load in HTML, or we could load back JavaScript. So if we wanted to load back JavaScript, for example, we could define that as app views messages index. Except this time it's not an HTML, but it's in JS. And let's just see if we can get something to pop up. So we'll refresh, and we'll call reload, and there we go. So we responded, we asked for a JavaScript. So here we said, go ahead and send a GET request to this path, and the format is JS. You can send, for example, a JSON, or you could ask for HTML, right? We ask for JS, and then when we actually look at what we send back, the controller knows how to respond to. It says format JS, and so it'll look for the index.js file, which we've defined here. So this is good, right? But this is kind of just a proof of concept. What if we actually wanted to return some things? So we could say, let's send back some messages, and we can use some jQuery to find that. And we'll send back some HTML so that the view can then display that. We just don't want to send back. We don't want to send back just plain HTML, because we want to make sure we escape it, sending it over the network. So Rails provides some handy way to escape it. You can call escape JavaScript, and you can say render messages. There's even a shortcut, so I think you just do J in Ruby, and we'll see what that looks like. So we'll refresh, we'll call reload, and here it says got back some data, and it looks like it's sending us back just the literal text that we typed in into here. And let's see what the network requests look like for that. So here's a response. It's going to look for a messages class in HTML, and then it'll say render messages. And it looks like we left this incomplete, so we got to close it off. The last thing we're doing is looking for a messages class, and we haven't yet defined that. So it doesn't quite know what to do. So up here, we'll say that class is messages, and we'll call it a list group. So let's see if we reload. Here we go. Now we got some data back. Right, so in the JavaScript, we told it to say find the messages, and this is using some jQuery, and write some HTML. And what should the HTML look like? Well, it should render, and it's using JavaScript escape, the messages. And what messages? These are defined in our controller, right? The room messages here. So when we look at the console here, we can start to see some HTML, and it looks like it's properly escaped. So we have escape characters here, which is good to recognize that it's actually some JavaScript. And this code is going to look at the messages class and set the HTML. So now let's see if we can demonstrate again using our two rooms. And let's go back and let's open up a new room. Let's go to the Ruby room. Cool. The last thing we've done, before we try to demo this, is we have our interval to 20,000. We'll keep it that way for now, and we'll call manually reload. So remember before when we called reload, it was window.location.reload, which did the whole page refresh like that, right? So you lost anything you typed in here. If you called that, you lost it. But now let's see if we can just reload the messages. So we'll say test2. This is from Bob. Now if we call reload, and first we'll print out the function, and the function looks like this. Can everyone see that? Right? So the URL is replaced by Rails. It's going to hit room/1/messages, and it'll get some data back. And so now if we call that, great, we got some data back. We printed it out, and the instruction in the JS was to go ahead and update the messages class based off this div. So it found the messages class, and it changed the HTML to the HTML that came back. And you notice that the message popped in. Great, so what happens if I already had some text in here, right? Some text. I was ready to send a message, and we decided to refresh the page. Would I lose it? We'll send the message, great. Now, here we can call reload, right? And we didn't lose our text because we didn't do a full page reload. We only refreshed the messages and re-rendered all the messages. We didn't lose any information that we already had in here. Does that make sense? So we're using an AJAX request to get back some information, and then modify the view as that information comes back in. One thing we now should do is on the index page, we have remote true. So that'll also send, when we create a new message, it'll also send it asynchronously. And we should probably, right, so it won't actually block and hold up and wait for that request to go through when it creates it. So now that we feel pretty confident, we can go ahead and create maybe every 5 seconds an interval. And let's see here. Send it, and there it shows up. And our console is telling us that we got some data back, and it's printing it out just for instructive purposes, which is kind of nice to debug. But as you start to send messages, they show up on the side without actually impacting and doing a full page refresh, just a refresh of the stuff that we're looking at. Okay, so that was kind of a lot, kind of covering but hopefully it kind of make clear the concepts of using nested resources. So we had rooms and messages, and we used fields for. We figured out how to find the nested attributes so we can create a room and a message at the same time. And then we talked about how to use AJAX to only reload certain parts of the page and not have to reload the full page, so that you can start to get some dynamic views being generated based off the server response. Are there any questions on that sort of stuff? Yeah, so this method's called polling, when the client polls a server every so often. And there's definitely problems with that, like you're always sending a request, even though there's not information there. You have to choose how long to choose the interval. It's actually not as bad as it sounds. A lot of companies still use polling because it's pretty easy to get set up. The client, only if you're actually looking at the page. If the you can even say if the client is active, only poll then. But there's another way to do it, which is more of a push method, which is called WebSockets, and we'll get into that next week. But that is where the server pushes the information down to the client, as opposed to the client fetching it on a periodic basis. And that, right, most people would agree that's probably the right way to go for these things because it's a push method. But even then, polling is not as bad as it seems. It's a pretty low latency request, just a simple send me back the messages. Pretty easy. Good question. Any questions? Ah, okay. It wasn't working on Heroku. Um, Heroku has its own interesting like Rails asset pipeline. Um, so I wonder if it was something to do. We're using Rails 5.1. Yeah. They they've kept the asset pipeline, but they have a whole bunch of new things in place to kind of help with this because the people have had problems in the past with the asset pipeline. Um, I wonder if it's yeah. I mean, I wonder if somehow there's some configuration that must have gotten screwed up. If you want, maybe we can talk about it after, and I can help you try to figure it out. Um, yeah, it should be the case that this sort of still works on Heroku. I wonder if somehow, yeah, some configuration or maybe like some manifest file got pushed when it shouldn't have. Um, yeah. Yeah, I think so. CoffeeScript was like the standard default for Rails because for a long time JavaScript didn't have great user experiences. I think lately JavaScript has improved a lot, especially with ES6, and so CoffeeScript is less um, as needed. So you can definitely use JavaScript with ES6. Okay. Were you trying to use npm or was it? Okay. So you're saying JS worked fine for you, but CoffeeScript didn't. Okay. If you use CoffeeScript, you have to do rake assets precompile to convert the CoffeeScript into JavaScript. Um, but you sound like you prefer JavaScript, right? So yeah. Okay. Any